So the last session, the last question, today we are asking, how do I respond? The pragmatic task. And we have been using these kind of frameworks, sagely wisdom and what was last week? I don't remember. To help us to frame the task at hand and how we're going to handle that task. And this week, we are going to use the image of the servant leadership, to guide our conversation. Now, of course, leadership typically indicates that there are other people involved, and that's not always the case when we're trying to do our faith. Sometimes it's just ourselves, or sometimes it's, trying to control how we respond to another person versus how we are attempting to guide another person in how to respond. But I think we can still apply these same tenets to that, just thinking about how am I a good leader to myself? How do I allow my experiences, my feelings, my kind of gut reactions to things to be guided by some of this stuff that we've been talking about, these questions and the way that we answer them, and some of the frameworks that we've used to help us to be more faithful responders. So there are within this frame 3 different forms of leadership that are important. The first form of leadership is competence, the ability to perform a role well. You can't lead someone if you don't know what you're doing, or at least have some sense of what it is that you're doing. You shouldn't, perhaps. Not you can't, but you shouldn't. But within the framework of the servant leader, there is a strong need for humility. And when I say humility, I don't mean some kind of the false modesty that we sometimes see in our worldly leaders, that oh shucks, I'm just doing my job. Please don't fawn all over me and tell me how wonderful I am. A real deep understanding of our own limitations, of our own creatureliness, that God has created us just like God created anything else or anyone else. And so we are not in charge. We do not have all of the answers and all of the information that we could need to respond appropriately. And then that humility, I think, leads to the development of competencies, not based on our own needs or interests, but based on the needs and the well-being of the communities that we are trying to serve, of the people and situations that we're trying to respond faithfully to. So, for example, if we are encountering a lot of people who are refusing to wear masks, maybe we need to develop our competency in how do we handle those situations. What are some of the skills that we might develop in terms of talking to people who have different opinions than us and things like that. That would be an example of how we can develop competencies to respond to the needs of the community rather than our own interests and needs. The second form of leadership that we want to chat about today is called transactional leadership. And this is leadership in which we influence others or influence events through a process of trade-offs. So we're making a transaction. And this kind of, logic-based, reason-based, very matter-of-fact kind of thing might seem like it doesn't really fit into what we've been talking about, because everything within this whole system is very fluid, very much dependent on the situations, dependent on the movement of the Holy Spirit. But I think it's important to think about this, because there's a difference between transaction in a worldly sense and transaction in a spiritual sense, in a faithful response sense. And I think what that hinges on is how we can be aware of the difference between the felt needs, the expressed needs of the people that we're trying to serve or help, versus the deeper needs of those people that they're not even potentially aware of, kind of the underlying need beyond the need that they are expressing. We can use transactional leadership to meet the felt need, meet the stated need, but also transform the felt need toward actually needing to fulfill the needs of others, thus meeting those deeper needs. So what I mean by that is, if I come to you and I say, gosh, I'm really having this problem. My children have grown up and they've left the house, and I just, I'm bored and I miss them and I don't really know what to do. And so you can take that need, and through transactions, you can say, well, if you would be willing to give up some of your time, I could connect you to this youth mentoring program, and I could help you to develop some new relationships with some kids who might be able to kind of give you some of that meaning back into your life. And so then over the course of that transaction, if I say yes, I will do that, then my need transforms from my own loneliness, my own kind of turned inwardness of the problem, and focuses more on my need to fulfill the needs of those children, of others. And so now, instead of you just meeting my initial need, you could have said, well, why don't you just call your children daily and talk to them on the phone, and then that way you'll be able to connect to them better. That would have met my initial need, but it would not have met my deeper spiritual need for belonging and purpose. So by guiding me toward serving others through the transaction, you're actually helping me to transform, which is the third type of servant of leadership that we want to talk about today, which is transformational leadership. Transformational leadership is the process of navigating through deep change in identity, deep change in mission, deep change in culture. And this is what we're going to get at a little bit deeper in our conversation today. So as we're starting to look at this transformational change, I wanted to talk a little bit about change, because we have fear of change, obviously, in our world, in our culture. It's even inherent in who we are. We talked at the very beginning about when you come up short in your education, in your learning, and your engaging with the world, the first thing you want to do is try to use inertia to keep on plowing through, take that new information and stick it into the system as it already exists. Or if you can't do that, reject it and outright push it aside, say, no, this can't be right because it doesn't fit into my system, and keep on chugging along. The last thing you want to do as a human is spend the time that it takes to bring in new information that doesn't fit, so that you have to adjust to it. You have to make changes to your system, whatever that system happens to be, in order for it to fit. That's just, it takes more work, it takes more energy, it takes away from your ability to survive. If we're talking about our early ancestors who were just trying to feed themselves enough in a day to live till the next day. So why would we want to be leaders toward change? Well, I think that within the framework of faithful living, faithful response, we need to see the change as having a bigger purpose. We need to see that there is a sense of urgency about the need for the change. We need to see that there are goals that could be met if we make the change. And we need to have plans that we can use to address setbacks as we work toward those goals, so that the change fails, or so that the change doesn't fail, and then we have no way to move forward, so that we've changed basically for no reason. So to have a reason for our change changes the equation entirely, so that it's no longer change for the sake of change, doing this scary thing for no reason, but it actually gives us a goal that we're using the change to meet. So with these things in mind, I would like for us to take a look at Psalm 72. Psalm 72, and we're going to look at verses 1 through 14. Anybody up for reading that?
I can read it.
Thank you, Karen.
Give the king thy judgments, O God, and thy righteousness to the king's son. May he judge thy people with righteousness, and thine afflicted with justice. Let the mountains bring peace to the people, and the hills in righteousness. May he vindicate the afflicted of the people, save the children of the needy, and crush the oppressor. Let them fear thee while the sun endures, and as long as the moon throughout all generations. May he come down like rain upon the mown grass, like showers that water the earth. In his days may the righteous flourish, and abundance of peace till the moon is no more. May he also rule from sea to sea, and from the river to the ends of the earth. Let the nomads of the desert bow before him, and his enemies lick the dust. Let the kings of Tarshish and of the islands bring presents. The kings of Sheba and Seba offer gifts, and let all kings bow down before him. All nations serve him. For he will deliver the needy when he cries for help, the afflicted also, and him who has no helper. He will have compassion on the poor and needy, and the lives of the needy he will save. He will rescue their life from oppression and violence, and their blood will be precious in his sight.
Okay, so this is a psalm of description of prayer on behalf of the king. And if you recall from the wider narrative of the biblical story, the people were freed from slavery in Egypt. They were brought to Canaan, to the land flowing with milk and honey. And they, through God's intervention, they were able to subdue the people who were living there, which is problematic on its own, but we'll get to that later. And they were able to establish their tribes in this land as their own. Over time, they were given judges to help them. They would get themselves into trouble, and they would cry out to God asking for help, and God would send these judges to help them. And then we get to Samuel, who in some ways is the last judge, and in other ways is the first prophet. And he is with the people, and they are crying out to have a king. They want to have a king, an earthly king, like all the other nations. And they say, we want to have a person as our king, like everybody else. And God says, well, I'm your king. You don't need a human to be your king. And they say, no, we want to be like everybody else. Please give us a king. And so Samuel comes to God and says, hey, they want this. What should I say to them? I don't want to do this. That they don't understand what it is that they're asking for. And God says, well, if that's what they want, I want you to give it to them. You're going to anoint a king, and this person is going to rule over them, but they're not going to understand really what that means until they see it happen. That a king is going to treat them poorly. A king is going to tax them. A king is not going to behave in the ways that I behave as their king. But give it to them because that's what they want, and they can kind of see for themselves what it is that they were asking for. And so this psalm is an attempt to describe what a good leader looks like from their perspective. So I wanted to look at this because we're talking about servant leadership, so that we can think about what are the characteristics of a good leader according to this passage. What are some of the differences between this kind of good leader and what the world expects from a leader? And are there any characteristics here that kind of don't fit with our modern understanding of leaders, or is this still pretty applicable? So those are some of the questions that I have for us to ponder as we look at this.
Well, I have highlighted the verses 12 and 13 about he will deliver the needy when he cries for help, and the afflicted and who has no helper, compassion on the poor and needy, and the lives of the needy he will save, rescuing their life from oppression and violence. And to me, that should be the role of a leader, but I'm not sure that I always see that. I sometimes think that people get into a leadership position and they care more about themselves and about how they're going to get ahead and climb the ladder and do all those things than they do about caring for the people that are around them. And yet the really good leaders that you see are the ones who care about the people around them and lift them up and don't worry so much about themselves, and yet they rise to the top because of their actions,
Mm-hmm.
But you don't see that a lot. Especially, it seems like with the younger people in the business world and things like that. They get into leadership positions, but they don't honor those around them. They're just more concerned with their own ambitions and things like that. So yeah, I would say that makes a good leader, but they're kind of hard to find.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I don't see, I see God talking about a leader, but I don't see any discussion about allegiance to God, allegiance to a higher leader. This is all more dictatorial from what I can see, from what I understand and can read. But I don't, as I say, I don't see anything in there that describes what do I want to say? A meaning in the person's life that would really lend itself to the teaching of God.
What does your verse 1 say, Ben?
Pardon?
What does verse 1 say in your translation?
Endow the king with your justice, O God, the royal son of your righteousness. He will judge your people, the afflicted ones, with justice. This is basically Solomon talking about what God is going to do for the king and to the king. But I don't see anything that is the other way around, an allegiance to a higher king, if you will. Maybe that's not supposed to be part of it.
Yeah, I think that's a good point.
Yeah, it just looks very worldly to me, with the exception of, as Karen mentioned, a few verses in there.
Yeah, so it's kind of interesting. Verse 1 in my translation, it says, "Give the king your justice, O God, and your righteousness to a king's son." So I think that this is pointing in some direction toward living God's way, toward, allegiance to and obedience to God's way of doing things. But it's from a different perspective, which is kind of interesting. It reminds me of some of the later prophets, some of the minor prophets who talk about, and even Isaiah has some of it too in the later Isaiah chapters, about, we are wrapped up in religious ritual and kind of doing the motions properly. But what God really wants is for us to act with justice and love mercy and walk humbly with God. So that allegiance to God, perhaps in the context of leadership, is not so much spiritual as it is practical. When you receive the justice of God, when you receive the righteousness of God, you are going to behave in the world as God would behave, hopefully. And so kind of what is important, what is important for faithful living? It's interesting. It kind of, I didn't have this in mind for us to talk about today, but as we're talking about this, it piques in my mind the story of the two sons. The father says, "Go work in the vineyard," and the son says, "Sure, I'll do it," and then doesn't do it, versus the son who is told, "Go work in the vineyard," and he says, "No, I'm not going to do that," but then he ends up going and doing it anyway. Is faithful living about our awareness of God's presence, of our awareness of God's desires for us, so that we can make decisions that way? Or is faithful living about the behaviors themselves, about acting on those things? And I don't think we want to put too crisp a distinction between those two things, because as humans, it's impossible for us to maintain this kind of counter cultural behavior and living without having a relationship with God, without constantly going back to receive refreshment and renewal for the tasks at hand. But in kind of in a vacuum, in a world where, perhaps God is pouring God's justice into the leader, is it more important that the person's behaviors look faithful, or is it more important that the person is aware of their faithfulness? And this seems to indicate that the first is the answer to that question. And certainly there are other places where the other answer would be more appropriate. But it's interesting, Ben, because what is faithful living? What is the doing of our faith, and what is the priority that we ought to be putting on it? Kind of takes me back to when I was growing up in several denominations that had more of an evangelical bent to them than the Lutherans do, and the conversations that we had about evangelism, about missions. You did service not for the sake of serving people, not for the sake of helping them to, have a better home or have more food or whatever it is. You did it so that while you were with them, you could witness to them. You could tell them about Jesus so that they would convert, they would repent, they would be saved. And I am not sure that those strict distinctions are the correct way to interpret that. I think that through our serving, through our meeting of people's needs, through our acting with justice and righteousness, we are using our bodies, we're using our lives to witness to who God is.
So Katie, in
Yes.
my Bible version here, it just says verses 1 through 8. So I'm not quite sure where the breakout is. But wouldn't the deal be this says, please stand up for the poor, help the children of the needy, come down hard on cruel tyrants. Oh, I think our guy is here.
Oh,
Anyway, that would be the point, would be doing all that for those who have less. Isn't it?
yeah. And how does that, I think the question is, how does that connect with faith? Yeah, go ahead.
Go. Priority.
Yes, get that air conditioning fixed.
You can't minister to her when she has a physical need.
No. But yeah, I think it's, I think the evangelical position is that we don't really care about the physical needs of these people. We just care about their, where they're going to go after they die. And so that's the focus. We just meet the needs so that they'll listen to us. I think that's incorrect. But I also think that the way that mainline churches deal with this, with these two things, I think the way that mainline churches deal with these things is also incorrect, because we tend to then do the opposite. We tend to say, well, we're going to go out there and we're going to serve our community. We're going to do all this, all this labor. We're going to work for social justice, but we're never going to connect that to our faith for ourselves or for the other people. And so, for example, we take our youth on a mission trip to wherever, and we do this work, but we don't talk about why we're doing this work. And so we end up looking just like the secular humanist, the person who believes that it's good to serve other people, to help other people in need, but they only do it for the sake of, because humans have inherent value philosophically. They don't do it because of any faith in God. And so I think that there is, for good servant leadership, there's got to be a balance. There's got to be a middle ground there, that certainly we are focusing on justice. We're focusing on making the world look like how God wants it to look. But we're also doing that because of God, because we want to do God's will. And so
You shouldn't have to say that, right?
You shouldn't have to, but if you don't ever say it, then I think we start to disconnect them. I think we miss the point. We forget the why of the behavior. And I think that's what we're missing in the mainline churches.
But by your works you'll be known, so that would fit there.
Yeah, and this seems to indicate that too. It's not about having a relationship with God. It's not about expressing through words. It's about the behavior. It's focusing on, how is this leader living? How is this leader doing God's justice in the world? And sometimes we talk about these words, the word justice and the word righteousness in English, in Hebrew, are actually the same word, tzedek. And I think that can help us a little bit, because when we talk about righteousness, what is righteousness? Well, it's being right with God. It's spiritual uprightness. It's having a strong relationship with God. It's being spiritually centered. It's perhaps performing the tasks of your religious faith, your religious rituals properly and with appropriate diligence and attention. But then justice is about something completely different in our language, in our understanding. Justice is about everybody getting what they need. It's about the way that we engage with the resources that we have and how we distribute them through to make sure that everybody has what it is that they need in order to survive and thrive. And so those two things seem very different, but in Hebrew, they're actually the exact same thing. Justice is the way that we translate it when it has to do with human perspective, and righteousness is the way we translate it when it has to do with God's perspective. So from God's perspective, justice and righteousness are the same thing. So what does that mean then for what, what a good leader looks like?
Okay, so Katie,
Yes.
I used to be in Beyond War a million years ago, and we would go to the retreat center in the Santa Cruz Mountains, and they had up the golden rule from all the religions, and they were all the same, different words, but all the same. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you, or variations on that. So basically, it seems to me, I mean, I feel like I'm being awkward, but if you're trying to do God's work on earth, we are all trying to do the same thing, I would think, no matter which faith we have. We would all be trying to feed the poor and the needy if you're following a faith. So I guess I'm perplexed on why you would need to point that out to anybody. Because it should just be obvious, shouldn't it?
Well, so if all people of all faiths are kind of doing the same thing, then what makes you different? What changes your behavior because you're a Christian?
I'm a Christian because of where I was born. I mean, I suppose if I was born someplace else, I'd probably be a Muslim. We had a minister a few years ago who said, all the faiths are so similar, just focus on the one you were given. That should be sufficient to do the good work you need to do. So instead of changing faiths and becoming a Buddhist or a Muslim or whatever, I can just focus on being a Christian. Somebody else can focus on where they were born and follow their faith truly. And hopefully we'd all come out with the same guidelines in general.
So I would point you toward a book. It's just a little thin volume. Let me see if I can find it real quick.
Have you guys been told that someplace in your past? Or is it just my experience?
I haven't ever thought about it that way.
I haven't either. I haven't thought about it that way. Yeah.
Well, good. A new thought for the day. This is good.
But
so this is called the Isaiah Vision. It's by Raymond Fung. And it's called An Ecumenical Strategy for Congregational Evangelism. And it talks about how we tend to start evangelizing. If you are the kind of church that does evangelism, you start by inviting people into your space, into your worship, into participation in your community from that perspective. But the Isaiah vision, the vision that comes out of the prophet Isaiah, is something else. Instead of inviting people to worship with you so that they can become disciples, you invite them to be a disciple with you so that they can build that relationship and then sometimes perhaps be interested in your why. So there is no difference within the context of this book for Raymond Fung. There's no difference between a Buddhist or a Sikh or a Muslim or someone of no faith doing good work in the community versus a Christian on the face of it. But what is different is why you are doing it. We are doing it as Christians because we are following in the footsteps of Jesus Christ. We are disciples of Jesus Christ. And as disciples of Christ, we are called to take up our cross. We are called to suffer, to give up things that are beneficial to us for the sake of others, because that is the model that we were given by our Lord. And that is something that is not is unique to Christianity, not the idea that you suffer and serve others, certainly, but the specific source that we get that from Jesus, from the experience in the life of Jesus and the death and resurrection of Jesus. And so the why is the difference. And so on the face of it, it doesn't make any difference on, does the person who's starving to death care that you are giving them that bread because Jesus told you to versus because you just think it's the right thing to do? Of course not. They just are grateful to have something to eat so that they can survive until tomorrow. But the way that we live faithfully, the way that we respond to situations is, according to Fung, done as Christians for a very different reason than other people do. So if you're interested in more of that, I would recommend this book. It's not,
So
not
what's
really
the
long.
author?
What's that?
Who's the author?
Raymond Fung, F-U-N-G.
Not a Scandinavian, huh? Okay.
Most of them are, aren't they? But it's not real long. It's only like 50 pages, and I found it very helpful to kind of give me a new perspective on those things, because I have church hopped so much. It was difficult for me to navigate these different structures. But I think that kind of brings us into our next section here with Jesus as the Messiah. God chose Jesus as this king, but kind of turns everything on its head. The king is no longer the person with the power. The king is the suffering servant. And the use of those suffering servant songs in Isaiah as a description for the Messiah was a Christian innovation. That was, all the Isaiah writings were part of the canon for the Jews, but they didn't connect the servant songs about the suffering of the servant with the Messiah until the Christians came along and made that connection. And so I think that is why when we're reading about Jesus' ministry and his disciples' response to his ministry, there's a lot of misunderstanding. At first, he is this great miracle worker. He is this amazing teacher. He's drawing these huge crowds of people. People assume that he is going to be the political Messiah who is going to rise up and free us finally from the bonds of oppression from the Romans. But then as we move through the story, Jesus starts to make some comments that are troubling. He talks about his impending suffering. He talks about how he's going to die. And so you remember that Peter rebukes him about this. Of course you're not going to die. You're the Messiah. The promise in Isaiah is that the Messiah will rule forever. And so you can't die. It's not until after the fact, it's not until after Jesus dies and is resurrected that they finally get it. The meaning of this suffering becomes clear. Jesus is not dying for nothing, but he is dying as a ransom for many, for the fellowship of suffering, so that he can participate in and redeem us from our suffering. And so for Christians, the norm for discipleship is defined by the cross. Jesus is willing to suffer and die for us. And so if we want to be faithful, then that's the pattern we have to follow. We have to pick up our cross, follow Jesus into that place of suffering on behalf of others. And so that is the servant leadership model that we as Christians follow.
Okay, but you were asking about justice and righteousness, and there being the same thing. And I don't know if we interpret it that way or not.
No, we don't. In our language, those are completely different concepts. And so when we translate the Bible and choose one or the other because of the context, that is an editorial choice, and that's an interpretation, because we don't have a word that means justice and righteousness at the same time.
Do you think they're the same?
I think so.
I mean, regardless of our language, do you think that the spirit of justice and the spirit of righteousness are the same thing?
I think so. I think that for God, righteousness is about doing right by God, being the people that God created us to be, behaving in the ways that God created us to behave, living in relationship with the world in the way that God intended it to be lived. And because as as earthly creatures, we look around us and we can't act outside of our interaction with the rest of creation. We see that differently. But from God's perspective, from above, there is no difference between righteousness and justice, because what God wants us to do, the way God wants us to behave, who God wants us to be, who God created us to be, is just. The relationships that we have with other people, rightly formed, is righteousness. So I think we make a differentiation between how we treat others and how we treat God, but I don't think God makes that same distinction.
Okay.
But it's something to think about. You ready to move on? All right, so then we move from Jesus in this pattern into the formation of congregations, into the formation of the people of God. And so as we try to understand what servant leadership looks like, how do we respond to situations that we encounter and are trying to be faithful about, Paul gives us some norms to help us to understand what justice and righteousness look like in community. He focuses on mutual care and service. He talks about those who have power using it on behalf of those who don't, or voluntarily giving it up in favor of serving the needs of the powerless. He talks about, those who feel like it's okay to eat meat should do so unless there's somebody else there who is feeling threatened by that, in which case they should voluntarily give up that right and not do it, because they want that their interaction with that person and the way that person is feeling is more important than their right to eat the meat. We might call this one anothering, because he says that a lot. One another, do this for one another, to one another, with one another. The second kind of tenet from Paul is the reduction of societal hierarchies. He says that there's no longer Jew or Greek, there's no longer slave or free, because the only head of the church is Jesus Christ, and everyone else is in a relationship of mutuality and equality of status. And so the hierarchies of the world don't apply within this model of servant leadership, because Christ is the only one who is above anyone else. Finally, we have the tenet of nonviolent love. There's a rejection of violence. There's a rejection of retribution. For example, in Romans 12, Paul talks about how we shouldn't respond in violence. We shouldn't respond in an attempt to seek vengeance. Instead, we should leave it up to God, because by doing so, God might use our reconciling behavior, our nonviolent love response, to bring transformation to that relationship. Whereas if we respond in the way that's expected, with additional violence against violence, then there is no hope for transformation. So Paul kind of sets up the Christian life as a contrast to the world. It represents a different way of living, and because it is so radical, if people pay attention to it and if it is done in the correct way, it can catalyze social transformation and bring that change to the rest of the world. And so it kind of takes us back to that. Why does God bless Abraham? Not for the sake of Abraham himself, but for the sake of the blessing of the world. Through him, the world can be blessed. So we are called to this servant leadership, to take up our crosses, to live in this contrasting way, so that we can catalyze change in our world and bring that blessing of change to the world. And that is what servant leadership is, transformational servant leadership, which was the third type of leadership that we talked about at the beginning. So coming back around to that, again, I said before that transformational leadership is navigating through a process of deep change in identity, mission, culture, or systems, operating systems. And so when we transform these things, when there is deep change in our identity, in our mission, in our culture, there's also a change in what it means to be competent, one of those other forms of leadership, competency. What do we want to be competent in? How are we competent? Well, if we're living the way that the world lives, then our competencies are going to be in things like, attracting more people, making more money, having more fame. But what we want to be competent in as we transform, those competencies are going to look a lot different. It's the same thing with transactions, the transactional leadership. If the goal is, if we're working within the regular system, secular system, then our transactions are going to look like us attempting to benefit ourselves or our own goals over those of the other person. But if our transactions fit within this transformational leadership model, then the way that we attempt to transact is going to, like I suggested, is going to be more about transforming the person with whom or the situation with which we are making the transaction, so that it can be moved toward changing the goals, so that it's more about serving others, more about meeting those deeper needs than about ourselves and furthering our own goals. And so when we fully participate in this transformational leadership, when we lead from this place of servanthood, we are going to be transformed by and transform the world through our own suffering and through the model, following the model of the suffering of Christ. We can only find our way by getting lost. We have to take risks. We have to allow for the loss of control to threaten us, but certainly not overwhelm us. Because deep change is discontinuous with the past. We don't have any grasp on how this is supposed to look or what it's supposed to be, because we're trying to be different. We're trying to do something different. We have to be aware that power comes only by empowering others and disempowering ourselves. We have to put ourselves in positions of risking being marginalized or being dismissed or being worked over. We have to be prepared for our positions to not be the place where all of the power and influence come from. And we have to keep our own self-worth out of it. A lot of times when we are trying to help other people, when we're trying to live out our faith in a positive way, it's about kind of our ego, our sense of who we are, and improving that sense of who we are by improving ourselves. But this is not about self-improvement. This is not about the self-help section of the bookstore. This is about making faithful choices for the sake of others. And if your own self-worth, if your own attempts to improve yourself get in the way of that, then it's no longer about the others. You're making choices for yourself rather than making those choices for what is best for the world, for God's kingdom. And so we have to keep those things in mind.
Some years ago, I was probably in the 60s or 70s when this idea went around that if you do things for other people, you're really being selfish because it makes you feel better. And so that was just this thing of, yeah, you can say you're doing all these things for other people, but you're really doing them for yourself. And I think a lot of the things that I did back then, volunteering for different things and all of that, took me away from my children in ways that when I look back on it, I wish that I hadn't done. But I was doing it to fulfill some kind of need in me for being out with adults and, carrying on in the world.
Mm-hmm.
And so I've apologized to them a lot for that, but it's probably true that you do things for other people so that you'll feel better and you can feel self-righteous and all of that kind of stuff.
Yeah, I think it's challenging, certainly, when we're talking about all of this. We talked last week a little bit about remembering that, we are still people who are bound by sin in some ways. And so we have those limitations. Everything that we do has those limitations because all of creation is tainted by sin. Even our attempts at altruism are going to be tainted in some way because of, the good feelings that we get from that. But being aware of why you're doing something, having awareness of those different elements and making those decisions anyway, or in spite of it, or because of it, I think is the best that we can do. My position is I volunteer a lot of hours with the car fire recovery, and that takes me away from my family and away from my kids. And especially when I first started it, I didn't have a job. And so I was looking for a way to get out of the house and feel like I was, doing something more than myself at the time. And so it's very similar to what you're experiencing. But I think for me, and I think for you too, if you think about it, isn't your using your time in that way modeling something to your children as well? Certainly you're taking away time from them, but you're also showing them, what's important. You're showing them that we shouldn't just live our lives selfishly and sit at home because that's what's best for, our individual nuclear family. But then at the same time, it's also about fulfilling your need for being around adults, and fulfilling your need to be meaningful in the community beyond just your family, and all these things.
Right.
And so I think just being aware of those things, acknowledging those different complexities, and making sure that as you make decisions about how you are and aren't going to spend your time, that you are careful not to make decisions just because you want to feel good, but because you've weighed all these different things and decided that this is where God is calling you to be, and this is where you're going to be able to do the most good. That's the best that we can do, I think, within the sinful structures of the world that we live in now.
Yeah. Yeah. I was just thinking too about what you wrote about responding not with violence, but fulfilling a contract with the world. And I was thinking about Martin Luther King Jr. and how his nonviolent campaign or contract with the world caused some really deep change. But he was primarily following what he felt God wanted to do, in the world. He was trying to act as his catalyst and create this change. And so the violence really doesn't accomplish what the people want it to accomplish. It turns people away, and the way that they were the marchers and stuff were beaten and stuff like that actually galvanized the other side, to say, no, this isn't right. We can't do this to people,
Mm-hmm.
And so it's really interesting. I never thought about, in fact, I asked, I think it was Pastor Al one time, I asked him, why is it that the more Christian you try to be, the harder it is? It seems to me like living a Christian life is just really, really hard. There's expectations on you all the time. And if you're truly being true to yourself and true to what you think God wants you to do, it's hard. Maybe that's why other people don't,
Don't do it.
Yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, I think it's because of that. It's because it's countercultural. It's because it is threatening to people who aren't in that same place. Even other Christians can be in a place that they aren't ready to. Like I was talking about there at the end about how do we participate in the transformational leadership of the suffering Christ. We have to get lost. We have to take risks. We have to allow ourselves to feel threatened by the discontinuity and by not knowing what to do. We have to give up our own power. We have to keep our own interests and self-worth out of it. There are a lot of people who claim Christianity, and I certainly wouldn't take that away from them, but there are a lot of people who aren't ready for that. That's not where they are. And so you behaving in that way, they see that. They see that you are being faithful in a way that they aren't, and that's threatening to them. And so you're going to get a lot of pushback, not just from the outside, but from the inside as well. And I think that has a lot to do with it. Being a faithful Christian is hard, and it's challenging to not just you, but to everyone around you when they see it.
So I heard that when Jimmy Carter first came to the White House, he brought his own suitcases in, which made many people disrespect him. It's kind of that thing. I mean, he was being a regular guy, a humble leader. So it's hard in some cases, I guess, to keep the respect up because you're not behaving as they think you should be to be the leader.
Mm-hmm.
I thought that was really interesting because I just thought it was great that he did that. I thought it was humble and refreshing, but others didn't see it that way.
Well, and again, it kind of comes down to the I guess the focus of this whole thing, which is, there's never a cut and dried answer, because was him doing that was showing humility. It was showing that he was a regular guy. It was expressing to the world that he was here to serve and not to be served. But then what does that do to the people who are hired and get paid to carry those suitcases?
I think there was more. It was okay.
But you see what I'm saying, that
Yeah.
nothing, no decision we ever make is ever going to be black and white. And so we have to weigh these things, but being as aware of all the different angles as possible is going to help us to be more faithful responders, even in situations where there could be 2 ways to go forward that would be faithful, or there are really 0 ways to go forward that are completely faithful, because we know that there are problematic areas in any decision that we make. But the ability to think through, to use some of these questions or not, if they're not helpful to you, but to just stop yourself and say, look, this is a challenging situation. And if I'm not keeping in mind the different possibilities here, the different factors at play, I might make a decision that is not as faithful as it could be if I do just take a moment to consider.
We good?
Good.
Better?
Yeah.
Is it on? Is it on?
It's down to 90 now. We're getting better. I can feel the cool air.
Take your computer and go sit on a vent.
I also think that risk and reward enter into this also, that our people seem to always have a reward in mind. And I think, to me, that's what separates me as a Christian from other people, is I don't expect a reward for what I'm doing.
Mm-hmm.
I already have the reward before I do the task, if you will. And that's what I find. It's especially among people that are just doing it out of the goodness of their heart. It is, but they feel good about, well, I gave part of this to an individual, and my reward is I get to deduct it off my income tax.
Right.
That,
right.
I mean, used to be, and that's what I see in a lot of people, Christian people, that they don't want a reward. They're not thinking of a reward at all. And my discussions with them is, we already have the reward. Our acts are coming out of the gratefulness for the reward that we already have been given, mainly,
Mm-hmm.
Christ on the cross. So I think that enters into a lot of it too.
Sure. Yeah. We it's that transaction thing, right? It's what is the transaction about? Is it about meeting one of those felt needs, like, self-worth or ego, or even, what other people think of us? Or is it one of those deeper needs, like the satisfaction of being connected with God, to knowing that we are fully living into who God created us to be, and being guided in that way by the transactions that we set up with ourselves and with others. Good point, Ben. All right, so the last thing that I have for us before we wrap this whole thing up is I've got a case study. And I'm going to tell you a story, and then I'd like for us to use some of this process to discuss the story, figure out, what we're going to do in terms of steps toward responding, toward figuring out how we're going to handle this. So I've got the story, and then I do have additional details that I'm not going to tell you within the story that might come out as we have our discussion about, what it is that we're going to do. In some cases, you might ask questions that I don't have the answer to, and we can either make something up or just say, oh, well, we don't know, so we can't include, we have to work within the vagueness of that. But then hopefully we can come up with, even if we don't come up with a solution, this will help us to kind of practice this a little bit now that we've got all of our questions under our belts. So any questions, comments, anything else before we do this?
This in the form of a final exam?
Yes. Yes. If you don't get the right answer, you fail, and we have to do it again. All right. So here's the story. So in this story, you are the council president of your local congregation, and this story is called The Swing Set Incident. So within the last you know, 5 years or so in your congregation, there has been a major push toward involving more young families. Your congregation about 5 years ago was made up of a lot of older people, but in the neighborhood immediately surrounding the church, there were a lot of young families moving in with children. And so your congregation decided that you really wanted to focus on serving these people. And so about 2 years into this process, you've now got a nursery set up, you have a Sunday school program, and you've got a youth group established. The Congregational Council decided just a few weeks ago that they were going to install a swing set on the grounds next to a pavilion that has been on the grounds for a couple of years, so that the parents of the children could come out and talk and have coffee while their children played right next to it, next to the pavilion. They could keep an eye on them while they played on the swing set. So 2 weeks later, you get a call from a member of the congregation who happened to drive by the church. They are dismayed to report to you that the swing set is gone. It has disappeared. So you rush over to the church, you get out of your car, and you start to walk around the property looking for this swing set. And you find that the swing set isn't actually gone, but it has been moved. It's now positioned in the back of the property behind the building. A few days later, after a little bit of sleuthing, you find out that Mary Jo James, the longtime church treasurer, had hired some men to move the swing set in the middle of the night. They were instructed to dig deep holes and set the poles in with concrete so that it could not be moved. So now the parents of these young children are feeling upset. They are fairly new members, and so they are feeling unwelcome. Why would you do this to us? Do you not want us to come here anymore? Some of the longer time congregation members are also angry because they've been investing all this time and energy into expanding the congregation and their ministry, and they don't understand why Mary Jo did this. And so they decided that they were going to put the swing set back where it had originally been, despite the challenges of having to break up the concrete and pull it out of the ground and move it back to its original spot next to the pavilion. So they accomplish this, and then they assign you as the council president to visit Mary Jo and find out what's going on. Why did she do this? So you aren't very happy about this encounter, obviously, but you get in your car and you drive over to Mary Jo's house and you walk up to the door, you ring the doorbell, and she answers the door with a box of paperwork and ledgers. She hands the box to you and says, "I quit. I'm quitting the church too." Then she closes the door. What do you do?
Well, this is kind of unfair because we don't know what structure the church council has. Can you share with us what kind of a structure they have?
So you are the president and Mary Jo was the treasurer. She may or may not be elected to that position, but she has been doing it for a long, long time. So it's not.
All decisions are made by the council?
What's that?
All decisions are made by the council?
Yes.
Okay. I'm still glad this isn't my decision.
Well, I don't know. For me, and I think you could take this case and apply it to many, many cases within congregations, probably even some going on now. But I would think that I would try to approach, she must have some friends in the church, that she's not alone. I would probably try to talk to some of her friends to find out what the problem is, not force myself on her, and find out why is she doing this? You're her friend. Does she talk to you? Is this her decision or what? Or just what's going on? And start working through her friends to have them talk to her and just find out what's happening.
Okay.
That would be my approach.
Okay.
It has been my approach.
Yeah. All right. So step number 1 is the descriptive task, asking the question, what is going on here? So Ben suggests that we could go to some of her friends and find out maybe some backstory, find out, why did she do this? So let's say that we, as the council president, we go to some of Mary Jo's friends and we find out a little bit about her backstory. Mary Jo married late in life. She married a widower named Jimmy James, and they experienced 10 happy years together before he died from cancer. At the time, Mary Jo said that Jimmy didn't like plaques. He didn't like, memorials that were physical signs of a person, but that he did like a good barbecue. And so she decided that she was going to give some money to the church to build the pavilion for fellowship in his memory. She didn't want any plaques put up on it to talk about, why it was built and who built it, but she wanted to have this barbecue or this pavilion so that whenever they had a barbecue, the church could remember Jimmy. So those are some additional pieces of information about what is going on.
See, I would have backed up a little bit before the swing set was moved from where Mary Jo moved it back to the pavilion. I would have not done that before there had been like maybe even a congregational meeting to talk about it. There should have been some kind of a discussion about why to move it back. I mean, regardless, it's already moved, but why? And what would it take to find out? There's got to be somebody there with a history with Mary Jo that would understand why it was built in the first place. That should have been able to tell them, no, this was done for this reason. I mean, we've had similar things in our church, where
And
we went through a remodel in it, and somebody wanted to take something down. I think it was the cross or the stained glass behind the altar, and one of the members had made those things, and then they were gone, and so there were people that were old enough to remember when they were made and when they were put there, and they didn't like it that it was just suddenly changed. People don't like that. I mean, one of the things that you have is this continuity in a congregation. You have to have that historical perspective as well.
Mm-hmm.
And so before that had been moved back, I would have found out, first of all, who did it, and I would have asked then why they did it, or, I wouldn't have just gone and just moved it back. I guess is what I'm saying.
Well, the mob made that decision before you could stop them.
Yeah.
They were all angry and upset and wanted to reassure the young families that they were wanted and that nobody that was there anyway believed this, where it was on board with this person who moved it. So Karen, you bring up a kind of interpretational item here. You've moved us into the interpretive task. Why is this going on? Perhaps there is some family systems theory involved. Changes in the church are making some of the older members feel like they are being pushed out. They're unappreciated. The history of the congregation is being dishonored and disrespected. Perhaps also, because we've got Jimmy and his memory involved here, we've got some cultural issues with corporate identity and maintaining our ties to the past. From Mary Jo's perspective, because this pavilion is a memorial to her husband, and because it is the space where we're supposed to remember him and reflect, and because nobody consulted her before they made modifications to the area, this holy ground to her has literally been desecrated. She finds this pavilion area to be a holy space of memorial to her husband and kind of a symbolic marker to his role in forming the community identity of this congregation. And so by doing this without consulting her, we have desecrated this holy space for her. So those two things are certainly involved there.
But didn't the in the swing set enhance the pavilion? She didn't want any plaques on that space. She didn't want that sort of thing to happen. But it was supposed to be used for families and for barbecues and for things like that. And so um, was it her own lack of children that caused her to not want something for the children there? I mean, did she have some kind of a bitterness about that? Or did she not see that it would enhance the use of that facility and bring the congregation together in that place?
Yeah, so that's that's good. So part of our why is this going on could bring in some psychology, that because of her experiences, not having any children, losing her husband, and kind of seeing that the use of this space is changing in a way that is not going to benefit her or her family directly, that she is feeling like she is not important in the community anymore. That she certainly has, if she's been the treasurer for a lot of years, she probably hangs a lot of her identity on that, especially having lost her husband. She has probably lost a lot of her social network that she had as a married person, and so she hangs a lot of her identity on her position as an insider, as the treasurer, somebody who is part of the inner insiders of this congregation, knowing what's going on a day-to-day basis. So to find out that this major change has taken place without consulting her, without her even being aware of it, could certainly make her feel disconnected in a way that she, a blow to her understanding of her importance to this community. They are important to her, but maybe now she feels like she isn't important to them.
So you really need to, what you learn from this is the importance of making sure everyone's included in a decision. Because everyone had good ideas.
Mm-hmm.
Having the swing set was good. Wanting the space for her husband was good. And I understand about feeling left out. Seems like the older you get, that comes with the age. I don't know. So I don't know.
All right, so we understand a little bit about what's happening and why it's happening. What should be happening? You say that everybody should be included in decision making. Certainly, that kind of fits into a theology of the body of Christ, that everyone is important, that everyone's participation is necessary for the full embodiment of who Christ is attempting to be through this congregation in the world.
So she needs to be talked with directly.
Yeah, but she doesn't want to talk to you.
But maybe that was just the council president. Maybe the minister could have a little chat with her.
Mm-hmm.
That person might be more neutral to find out what the story is, because apparently at some point here nobody knew why she did that. And it's interesting because somebody must have donated the swing set, otherwise the treasurer should probably know about that kind of thing, and any expenses involved with setting it up or buying it. So that's a little odd. But.
Yeah, so the assumption, Pam, which I like, that we should not just dismiss Mary Jo. We shouldn't just write her off as an old, stubborn fuddy-duddy who isn't part of the future of this congregation. We need to figure out a way to engage her. We need to figure out a way to work to make the community whole again. An ethic of reconciliation is what I would call that. So that's good about what ought to be going on. We need to reconcile with Mary Jo. We need to ensure that the full body of Christ is being honored, not just in terms of understanding the unity of the body in space, but also over time, right? That the recalling of the stories about Jimmy has to do with who we are as the people of God, that we understand how God has moved within our community in the past, which helps us to discern how God is calling us to move into the future. So we're honoring the memories of those people who came before, who served God faithfully, and making sure that they are continuing to be part of the body of Christ and the decisions that we make as we move forward. So both of those things are part of the what ought to be going on. So finally, number 4, how do we respond? What are we going to do?
I don't know how she decided to spend the money. To spend the money to have the swing set moved in the middle of the night? She knew what she was doing wasn't good. I mean,
It's an
she didn't
emotional
ask the
decision.
church council if she could move that
Yeah.
swing set. She didn't ask anybody. She just moved it. And where did the money come from? It came from the church treasury. That's not
Probably from
not
her.
how
She probably paid for it herself out
you
of her own
think.
pocket.
Well, we don't know that.
We don't know that though, yeah.
Into that.
Although we do have a box in our hands filled with all the ledgers, so we could find out if she wrote a check for that.
But
Yeah.
I just, I don't know how you're going to reach her. Maybe Pam's right. Maybe the pastor needs to breach the gap there and try to get her to
Send a
talk.
pastor, or maybe send one of those friends that we talked to at the beginning to
I
find
don't
out.
know.
the
Gotta be
backstory.
careful about friends.
Yeah.
Then you're triangulating.
Uh-huh.
So
I would try to mitigate the situation by, it's behind the church, and is there a way that you could put up some type of covering or benches or something so that the mothers could come out there and sit and watch their children?
Oh, well, that's too late. The congregation in the heat of the moment decided they were going to bust it up with their jackhammer and go put it back. So it's already been put back next to the pavilion.
Well, then you've lost not only her, I think, but you probably have lost many of her friends too with a decision like that. I would hope that a council would never do something like that without, touching people. We run into the same thing. We ran into the same thing there at at St. James with the pastor that wanted to build a brand new church, and that almost busted our church apart. When I was on the council at Trinity in town there, and we wanted to move the church, that almost busted the church in half because many people had a tree that was planted in honor of this person and stuff like that, and just would not move. So ergo, you find the church still there, but that was mitigated because it wasn't going to work. And that's what I would work on, is trying to mitigate what's going on before I begin a jackhammer approach to that. To me, they're just as faulty as she is when they do this. Now it's become an emotional situation.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Well, so now that the decision has been made and the move has taken place, perhaps you say it's not just Mary Jo. We certainly need to address her and maybe have the pastor or somebody who could speak to her, go to her. But to maybe maybe this is a symptom of a larger issue within the congregation.
Yeah.
That
That's what I'm thinking.
these older people who are connected to the past are feeling like they are being swept to the side for the sake of this new and younger generation. There is an us and them kind of feeling that is developing, if not already fully formed. And so to work with the congregation to transform that, to build relationships with the people who are new and the people who have been around for a long time, so that they can start to build their own community with everybody who is now part of it, so that we're not rejecting anyone who has been around for a long time, but we're also not creating systems that are unwelcoming to new people who are coming in who have different types of needs. So maybe we need some programming with small groups that intentionally mix the generations. Maybe we need a congregational meeting where we can kind of talk out some of these feelings and express some remorse over some of the behaviors that we've seen and the jerk decision making that's taken place. But to work out, that perhaps the young families just want to be part of that and don't know who Jimmy was, but if they understand, then their experience of drinking the coffee under the pavilion and watching their kids play off on the side yard will be even more fulfilling and more full for them because they are understanding and they're part of that history of the congregation. So maybe, maybe some of those types of conversations need to take place. But certainly I'm glad that nobody says, well, we ought to reject this person or kick this person out, because that's obviously, well, to me, that's obviously not the right way to go here.
No, but I think it points out a deeper problem within the church, the church body, that they need to work on some relationships. Definitely do.
I think that's a problem with almost every church. You have that taking place.
Well, it
It's
comes
subtle
down
and
to
it's
that
underneath.
communication, what I say and what you hear, sometimes two different things.
Mainly generational, right?
Yeah.
Right. To me, the option that I've always felt with councils and churches and like that is information. You have to send out information. You have to keep them aware. We always like a church. Anybody can come to a council meeting and sit in and just watch and observe. And very few. How many people do you know that come that come and sit? That's as I say. That's what I've in information, I guess you'd call it. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm glad that we don't have to actually navigate through this and that we can say, all right, those are some good ideas. We're done. But you can see, that this process is helpful for a variety of different situations, not just in the church, but in the way that you interact with people in your lives, in the way that you interact with yourself, and, making your decisions about how you're going to spend your money or what you're going to spend your time on or how you're going to respond to what somebody else has done or said to you, different things like that. So I hope that this was a helpful series and some helpful exercises for you to think about. Any final thoughts on this whole thing?
Well, I just wanted to share. I've been using a journal that I received for Christmas to write my notes in for this, and it has a monthly reflection. And so the page that I'm on now, what were the 3 biggest lessons you've learned in the past month? How are you different between this past month and the month before it? What or who are you especially grateful for? And then the last part of it is name 3 things you can improve on. What concrete actions can you take to work towards that improvement? So I'm going to spend some time now reflecting on what we've talked about and trying to answer those questions too for myself, because a lot of times I sit and think about things, but I don't really take action. I don't move it to action, and so you've given us a lot to think about. I really appreciate the way you teach. It's really, really, really helpful. But it takes me a long time to work through the layers.
Well, I appreciate that. And now you'll have a little bit of time. I'm looking at the calendar, and I think we're going to start our next session, our next series on August 20th. So you'll have about a month to chew on this one and prepare yourself, rest up so that we can jump into something even more challenging.
And is it going to be the same format? Are you going to do it online like this?
Yes. We're going to continue the Zooming.
Okay. That's great.